Support for Swan Song is brought to you by viewers like you. Thank you. When I first started this project, I knew that there was going to be one super intimidating episode to work on, and that day has finally come. Super Robot Taisen Compact 2 is the second WonderSwan entry in the Super Robot Taisen turn-based simulation RPG series, and it was released as 3 distinct parts, each released about 4 months apart from each other. Chijou Gekidou-hen, known colloquially in English as Earth Crisis, was released on March 30th, 2000. Uchuu Gekishin-hen, known colloquially in English as Cosmoquake, was released on September 14th, 2000. And Ginga Kessen-hen, known colloquially in English as Galaxy Showdown, was released on January 18th, 2001, making it the last game released without WonderSwan color support. For perspective, this came out a little bit more than 3 months after the last monochrome-only WonderSwan game. All 3 games were developed by Tose and published by Banpresto. Now, I don't usually reintroduce series we've already covered previously as part of this series, but I feel like it's warranted here. Super Robot Taisen Compact was the very first game in the series I had ever played, and in the years since, I've grown to play more games and really like the series, and in hindsight, I didn't really do the series justice during its first outing. Super Robot Taisen, also known as Super Robot Wars in English, is a series of turn-based simulation RPGs featuring robots and pilots gathered from a myriad of popular media franchises featuring giant robots. Aside from the original generation sub-series, which I'll explain a little bit later, each game is essentially a work of officially licensed and sanctioned crossover fanfiction, written by fans for fans, and because of this, the fans tend to love it. The writers for these games are really in touch with the what-if scenarios that fans of these franchises want to see come to life, and they deliver that with every game. The more familiar you are with mecha anime franchises, the more likely you are to latch onto this series, and that's exactly what happened to me over the past few years. The Super Robot Taisen Compact games were released at an interesting time in the series' history, as a pretty big transition in how these games were developed was underway at the time of their release. In 1999, Banpresto opted to move away from having all Super Robot Taisen games be developed by a single studio, known as Winkysoft, instead splitting up the series into multiple parallel sub-series, whose development would be spread across multiple studios. The most successful of these would be 1999's Super Robot Taisen Alpha for the PS1, developed by an in-house team known as Banpresto. Alpha would become the best-selling game in the series and set the new standard for mechanics, difficulty, and quality of life features offered throughout the series. To this day, it serves as a benchmark title against which newly released games are compared. Due to how well received Alpha was, Banpresto, known today as BB Studio, would ultimately handle the majority of series development from that point onward. Development of the Super Robot Taisen Compact series would be started in parallel over at Tose, and because of that, a lot of the positive feedback received for the changes from the Alpha subseries couldn't be incorporated into those games in time for release. The Compact 2 trilogy revolves around the conflict between Earth Federation forces and the big bad of these games, the extraterrestrial Einst. The Einst not only want to wipe out humanity due to their incessant thirst for war, but they want to replace humanity altogether with a new race devoid of feeling or soul. Central to this conflict are the protagonists of the trilogy, Kyosuke Nambu and Excellent Browning, 2 cadets from the Earth Federation who are also madly in love. Kyosuke leads the battle on Earth in Part 1 Earth Crisis, Excellent leads the battle in space in Part 2 Cosmoquake, and then everyone comes together for the big finale in Part 3. If those names sound familiar to you at all, both the protagonists and the Einst have been present throughout much of the Super Robot Taisen Original Generation subseries, which focuses on Banpresto original characters from past games. These games were released in the West as far back as the Game Boy Advance, largely because the cast entirely consisted of Banpresto original characters, which let them sidestep navigating the hellscape that is international anime licensing. That hellscape prevented the release of Super Robot Taisen games in the West until fairly recently. I guess you could say at this point that the WonderSwan's most notable exports continue to be storylines and characters to be reused in mecha games on other, more successful platforms. As a complete trilogy, Super Robot Taisen Compact 2 features guest pilots and mechs from the following series: Mobile Suit Gundam, Gundam the 8th MS Team, Gundam 0080 War in the Pocket, Gundam 0083 Stardust Memory, Zeta Gundam, Gundam Double Zeta, Char's Counterattack, Gundam F91, Mazinger Z, Great Mazinger, UFO Robo Grendizer, Getter Robo, Getter Robo G, Shin Getter Robo, Brave Raideen, Super Electromagnetic Robo Combattler V, Invincible Superman Zambot 3, Invincible Steelman Daitarn 3, Aura Battler Dunbine, New Story of Aura Battle Dunbine, Super Beast Machine God Dankuga, Dankuga Requiem for Victims, God Bless Dankuga, Dankuga Blazing Epilogue, Ninja Robot Tobikage, Dangayo Hyper Combat Unit, and Machine Robo Revenge of Kronos. Super Robot Taisen is differentiated from other turn-based simulation RPGs by two tentpole mechanics: counteractions and spirit commands. Every time one of your units is attacked, you're given a choice in how to react to that attack. You can counterattack, evade, or defend. Counterattack has you take full damage from their attack with the advantage of retaliation with an attack of your own. Evade increases your likelihood of dodging the attack altogether, taking no damage if successfully evaded, or full damage if not. Defend doesn't impact your chance of evasion at all, but it does reduce overall damage taken if you're hit. Since they always show you the odds of successfully evading and attacking on the combat action screen, whether you're the attacker or the defender, it all comes down to how comfortable you are with managing different levels of risk. Spirit commands are active skills attached to each of your pilots, which expend their spirit points when used. These must be activated before you take your turn with that unit, and most of them last either a single combat phase or until your next turn. There's a wide variety of commands available throughout the game, including massive buffs to evasion and hit rate, heals, damage multipliers, and more. Making good use of spirit commands can be absolutely critical to surviving the onslaught of enemy units coming at you on certain maps, and not having the habit of using spirit commands regularly can definitely make newcomers to the series hit a wall pretty quickly. The game is quite generous with how many spirit points you start off with, so you can generally use them pretty liberally. Oddly enough, in these games, your WonderSwan saved nickname is used as a random seed for the allocation of spirit commands amongst your various pilots. If you were using the nickname field as intended back in the day to show your name on the boot screen if you ever lost your system, you may have actually screwed yourself out of some really powerful skills if you were simply born with the wrong name. The Super Robot Taisen games are so satisfying to play simply because you always have access to the information you need to make informed strategic decisions, and if you happen to be in an unfavorable situation, you're generally going to have access to tools that can help you convert it into a favorable one through the use of limited resources. So many combat encounters in this game feel like puzzles to be solved, and maybe I'm just dumb, but I feel like a genius when a solution clicks for me and I get to move on to the next one. So after that description of the game's mechanics, it shouldn't be much of a surprise that I had a great time trying these games out. Of the mecha turn-based SRPGs on the WonderSwan thus far, this one definitely takes the cake when it comes to stellar presentation and polish. Much like in Compact 1, you won't be able to skip battle animations to speed up the pace of battle, as that was something introduced in Alpha that hadn't yet made its way back to the handheld games. Sitting through the battle animations honestly doesn't feel that bad this time around though. They feel less sluggish and higher quality, and they give a satisfying oomph to your attacks. Being three parts of a coherent whole, Super Robot Taisen Compact 2 lets you carry over data from each part to the next, but it probably doesn't work how you imagine it does. If you think this uses a link cable or maybe the WonderWave infrared accessory, you'd be wrong. Did you know that the WonderSwan has a small region of writable, persistent memory that is accessible by the game software? Let's say you beat part 1. From the title screen, you can choose the data transfer option to write some metadata about your completed game file to that region of memory in your WonderSwan hardware. When you pick up a copy of part 2, you can read that region of memory and import that metadata into your file, and the chain can be continued onwards onto part 3. So what exactly does doing this gain you? Parts 1 and 2 both feature secret events that, if triggered, will trigger special upgrades and units to be unlocked throughout later parts of the game. That's pretty much the extent of the Part 1 to Part 2 data transfer, but Part 3 is far more significant. The data transfer payload doesn't seem to be large enough to transfer full dumps of your pilots and units into the final part, so instead, the game lets you funnel all leftover money and unlocked parts from Parts 1 and 2 to let you reconfigure your units to be battle ready in Part 3. Most importantly though, the true ending of the game can only be played if you've carried over data from Parts 1 and Parts 2 and are entering the final mission with a total turn count of under 777 turns. If you're planning on playing these games on emulators, I recommend using the Eris emulator, as it's the most accurate and it properly implements this shared writable memory. Big thanks to friend of the show AC for pointing me in the right direction. On March 28, 2002, the entire Super Robot Taisen Compact 2 trilogy was remade into a single PS2 game, Super Robot Taisen Impact. This was the first PS2 release in the series, and built on top of an improved version of the engine from Alpha Gaiden, which is why it shares a lot of systems with that game that weren't present in the originals. Interestingly, there is some disagreement between Japanese and Western fans when it comes to the difficulty of this game. The consensus from Japanese fans is that Impact is significantly harder than the original titles, and it's mocked for having been marketed as having changes to make it more approachable to beginners, when everyone seems to think the opposite. Western fans, on the other hand, seem to think that it's an easier game, although the criteria which needs to be met to unlock the true engine is believed to be harder to achieve than the one in the originals. But ultimately, I don't know if this is simply a matter of Japanese players having played the trilogy as intended by transferring data from Part 1 straight through to Part 3, and Western players largely being debuffed by playing these games in emulators without the ability to transfer data and having to settle for the starting funds and items given in Part 3. One common complaint shared across both groups of fans is that the game is too long, clocking in at a massive 105 playable missions. While it's not abnormal for a game in the series to have that many unique missions, Impact requires you to play all of them in a single playthrough, which was definitely not standard for the series. A usual Super Robot Taisen game will come out to about 60 missions per playthrough, consisting of about 110 unique missions spread throughout multiple branching routes. Super Robot Taisen Compact 2 is an absolute pillar of the WonderSwan's game library, not just because of its unusual 3-part structure, but because it really shows off what these games can be when the team behind them is firing on all cylinders. It's incredibly ambitious both in scope and how it uses lesser known hardware features of the WonderSwan, and it's pretty impressive that they pulled it off. The series also has an incredibly satisfying game loop, and despite the trilogy's awkward timing as the series was redefining itself, it doesn't feel anywhere as dated as I expected it to be. But what's even more fascinating to me is reading online that fans don't even consider this to be the pinnacle of monochrome WonderSwan era SRPGs. Don't worry, we'll get to that one in due time, but I can't even begin to imagine how it's going to top this.